everyone, this is Arthi from Human Chapters. I'll tell you a bit about Human Chapters. Humans are living narratives with a past, present, and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these conversations is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a story to share. Acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we are. We pay respect to their tribal elders, past and present and emerging. We celebrate their continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. Today we are speaking to Shameka, and Shameka's chapter is Juvenile Forensics, Speech and Language Pathology. Yeah, over to you, Shameka. Tell us a bit about yourself and welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So a bit about me. I am a clinically licensed and certified speech and language pathologist in the United States. I am stationed or based on the East Coast, but I'm licensed in multiple states, excuse me. So I am also a PhD associate professor. And so I teach cognitive and communication disorders to master's and doctoral level students in the universities here in the US, in the DC metropolitan area.
That's amazing. Shameka, tell us a bit about your journey. What got you into speech and language pathology, and then more specifically into juvenile forensics? Oh, sorry, I think you are muted.
Pardon me. Okay.
Awesome. Oh, okay, beautiful. So Shameka, tell me, what got you into speech and language pathology, and then more specifically into juvenile forensics? Yeah.
Okay. So definitely two different journeys, very different journeys. So actually my first degree is a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science. So speech and language pathology was not the plan. It was not on the books. Of course, back then, early 90s, before the Y2K boom, computers was a thing, and everybody was kind of talking about we needed to get a degree in computers. So, my uncles and them pushed me into computer science. So I went to school for computer science. And then, of course, you had to take an elective to graduate. So I was already in my junior year by the time I learned about speech and language pathology, my junior year of college. And so I took a sign language class, and in that sign language class, I'm like, oh, I love this. This is so cool. What is this? And it was in a department of speech and language and audiology. And so they, I was like, oh, well, I'll just do this. But I was already too far along. So I just had to graduate out, with computer science. Otherwise, I would have had to stay in, university longer, which I did not want to do. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, once I graduate, I'll go back and just do the extra classes that I need, and then I'll practice. And then I think it was one of my professors that was like, well, you need a master's. By then it was like, we had just passed the requirement that if you only had a bachelor's in speech, you could be grandfathered in, which is, derogatory term here, but in the US. And so it was like, I need a master's, never mind, I'm not doing that. So I just went and did, computer science for about a year, took a break, and then I came back to speech. So I entered speech, long story short, because of an elective in sign language, primarily. And it's kind of weird because personally, I had a lot of experience with augmentative communication, which I ended up specializing in because my little cousin was born with cerebral palsy. And so she was nonverbal and she had an AAC device, but I just didn't connect that that was speech and language pathology at that time. But I did, a lot of work with her, helping her communicate when I was in high school and, up until that point. So when I got to my master's program, it was like a light bulb went off, like, oh, this is what this was.
Wow, what a journey from computer science to speech pathology. And
Yeah.
then how did it get you into juvenile forensics? And what is that?
Okay, so juvenile forensics is kind of, it also was full circle for me, which I'm realizing in my life, a lot of things in my past prepared me for where I am today and
Yeah.
what I'm doing now. So I think at about 2013, 2014, when we were seeing this increase in the US of fatal policing,
Yeah.
I started to really look into what was happening with why so many Black men were being fatally policed. And what I found from my research was 85% of those individuals had some level of a language and or learning disorder. So in the States, they were saying that it was mental health calls, but a lot of the calls were actually calls where the person, because of the breakdown, was also having communication breakdown. So like, for instance, the Eric Scott situation, that was actually, he was experiencing traumatic brain injury. So from that research, it was kind of like, okay, I need to focus on this because nobody's talking about this. This is
Mm.
the thing that is happening. And we're not really targeting the fact that this is bigger than just, Black men being fatally policed. This is also officers not recognizing how to properly de-escalate when there is
Yeah.
communication breakdowns that are, diagnosed. A lot of those individuals, Tamir Rice, Eric Scott, a lot of them had special education backgrounds that nobody was talking about. Freddie Gray. So I started doing research there first. And then as I was doing that research, I realized, I was kind of putting the cart before the horse, and I needed to have a conversation before post-mortem. We were talking about this after people were already being
Yeah.
fatally policed, where it was like, how can we talk to have this discussion as clinicians before it
Mm.
gets this far? And
Yeah.
so I kind of took a shift and added to my research about talking about the intersection between communication disorders and youth being involved with the justice system or police interactions. And that's kind of how it expanded. So sitting in my office, my my home office makeshift, I was kind of like, well, what am I going to call myself? Because this is very different and I need
Yeah.
something that's kind of different. And I was playing around with different things and was like, I'm gonna call myself the Juvenile Forensic SLP. And so I just went and trademarked it, and here I
That
am.
That's incredible. And Shameka, I would love to learn about, so 2013 to 2014, that's when you started researching, delving into it. What did your PhD is in that particular sphere. What did you learn? What was your research and what was the call to action based on that research?
So my PhD is in cognitive and communication. Communication sciences and disorders with a specialty in severe disabilities, child language disorders, and multiculturalism. So it just kind of was a roundabout thing. And so I think my, call to research was first about the limited awareness that law enforcement had during police interactions. That's where it started. And then around that time also, I think it might have been 14, 15 when Kim Kardashian started to talk about Centoya Brown. And so one of my research studies was on, Centoya Brown, because that was a big case, but nobody, and her lawyers had even at that time made a statement about not putting her on the stand because of her immaturity and, different things that were actually aligned to cognitive and communication based
Yeah.
disorders. So then, the study expanded from there. And then I kind of focused on Freddie Gray because nobody was talking about, the fact that he had the cognitive capacity of a 6-month-old. Those type of things that were being left out of the conversation. It was like, I wanted it to be known that speech and language pathologists had a necessary place in this discussion, a necessary place in this intervention, that we were not targeting. And this was bigger than just psychologists all the time.
Yeah. That is so interesting. And I suppose this then brings me to the question of frequently when someone asks, what does a speech and language pathologist do? It is a very loaded question.
Right.
The people within the field know what we are doing. Like we know maybe sometimes even we don't realize the extent of our scope, the breadth
Right.
of it. How do you explain to someone in a good way, in a robust manner, but simply what we do?
As a generic explanation is, just kind of explaining to someone that we address all areas of communication and when there are breakdowns in that communication. So if a person has difficulty understanding, if they have difficulty processing, if they have difficulty expressing something to you, we address that. We address those areas where there are difficulties with you understanding based on the intelligibility. It's a very long-winded, there's really no way around the fact that there's always going to be a long-winded definition, a dissertation definition for us. That's just it.
Yeah, I think in some of my explanations, I've been doing this to this. This is where we work.
That's a good one, right?
And the posture and like
Exactly.
it's really interesting. Okay, so then from have you had a chance to what sort of preventative measures have you been involved in, and has there been training for police, law enforcement, anyone actually that's perhaps working with these young people?
Good question. Yes. So, I started with the research and then I phased into training defenders, public and legal defenders, and then training judges. And I also have a program where I train clinicians to provide in-service to law enforcement in their states or municipalities, but I also provide in-services to law enforcement. So I've probably provided in-service awareness about cognitive and communication disorders and de-escalation techniques to about almost 1,000 law enforcement officers.
Wow.
And I've probably trained, now we're on cohort number 7, which just finished in July. So we probably have about 60, 70 something SLPs across the US who can provide in-service to law enforcement about cognitive and communication disorders and how to functionally de-escalate.
Yeah, and what are some of the things that you tend to talk about? And like, I'm just sort of trying to think about how we know what it is again, but explaining it to someone so that it makes sense to everyone, that's a whole different skill. What are some of these behaviors and theories that you might be touching upon?
Really, we discuss the salient features because, law enforcement most time are looking for the overt action. So we talk a lot about, salient features of communication disorders that, manifest themselves, like answering questions or, responses during body language, those type of things. And how I'm not necessarily training or preparing law enforcement or clinicians to diagnose. The goal of the trainings and the intervention is to provide a space mentally where, because this now, you're saying something else might be going on rather than you just looking sketchy or you getting ready to lie or you're reaching for a gun. This is more so about taking a step back and recognizing that if you're seeing these things, there could be another plausible reason why they are responding this way.
Absolutely. And what sort of a reception have you had from people that have experienced your training and gone out into the field of their work?
Law enforcement, it's all been good. I haven't, unless they, saying something behind my back I don't know about. I haven't heard anything negative. I've even had officers, reach back out and tell me that they did something different when they pulled somebody over. I had an officer tell me that he pulled someone over that he realized was a stutterer. And so he was more patient and he didn't, usually they think that the stuttering is the person is lying or making something up. He was more patient and that changed his whole traffic stops. So, the reception has been good. And those relationships are still consistent. So even in one of the counties here, all of the officers that come through the academy has to take the training. So it's becoming one of those mandatory preparations as well.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to ask is this going to be mandated or something, yeah, like nationwide? Or wouldn't it be amazing if that's what actually happened globally?
Yes, that would be ideal, especially because, I mean, at least, and things are a little different in each of our countries, but, especially in the US, how some states are test running, crisis intervention teams being clinicians instead of officers, and seeing that there is a change. We haven't heard about much fatal policing of those response calls now. So I think it would be ideal to have that domino effect occur.
That's so interesting. And so when you're talking about fatal policing in the States, I'm thinking about the Australian system. And while it's not, there is a component of that fatal policing. However, it's more, there are more subtleties in it as well. And can you speak a bit to those subtleties of, what law enforcement reactions could possibly be like, as opposed to the overt, transparent, fatal incident?
I think, like, just speaking from you and I, just the variations in, I think one time, and I forget, in my Facebook group, there was a clinician that was in the UK, and she couldn't understand this conversation we were having about disproportionate representation of race, the racial and ethnic disparities. And I had to break down this understanding that because the population most times in the UK, those New Zealand, those areas are more homogeneous to, the European white skin sector. Those minor subtleties are how they are responding specifically to Black and brown skin. So you may not be fatally policing me, but the fact that you are still consistently pulling me over or arresting me or, giving me a ticket or referring me to the court systems, the family courts, is still a thing. It's just not talked about as much because the population is not as large. So the mass incarceration looks different.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. There is a lot of that that sort of subconscious bias as well that goes on, where someone might not necessarily realize it until it's brought to their attention that this is what's happening. And I think day in, day out, just in everyday life, in everyday interactions, I think some of those things, people that have experienced it a lot are going to be acutely aware of it, as opposed to people that, it might be totally unintentional or ignorance even, but people that have experienced it, they're going, yep, here, there, yep, just in transaction, within those few seconds, this is what you've done.
Right. And I mean, just thinking about it, it's not common in the US either, but like, for instance, in which we call the DMV, the DC metropolitan area, DC, Maryland, Virginia, well, at least DC, Maryland, predominantly our law enforcement are Black. We have, especially DC, like we have a 85% Black law enforcement population. In Maryland, the counties in Maryland, PG County alone is a 98% Black office. So the response is different if you're thinking about other countries where there may not be but one Black officer, Black or brown officer on the force, or if that, so you have these subtleties where the discussion about bias and cultural racism doesn't come up because everybody's the same.
That's exactly right. And so for the part where there are 98% Black officers, have you worked with them? And if so, what sort of response or what sort of conversations do you have with them in comparison to your other conversations?
So yes, I work primarily with the sheriff's department, which is over the officers. So they come through the sheriff's department for the training. But the conversation doesn't change, because even though there is a racial makeup that is consistent to mine, there's a different culture. So the blue culture is still the blue culture. It does at some point, there's that internal rule that we don't know about as lay civilians that officers have with themselves. So I don't shift the conversation just because we both Black, because all skin folk ain't kinfolk. Just because we have the same color doesn't mean we believe the same thing. So they all still get the same training from me.
That's really interesting. And then comes the whole conversation of who's being disadvantaged, what sort of a community are you growing up in, and while you are a working class citizen, then that's the whole other ball game as well,
Right.
in terms of how you interact. Yeah. My other question is, in terms of sort of now preventative measure, going even, I suppose, conversations with children, conversations with teenagers. Do you work in that space?
So good question. I love this question all the time. This is one of my soapbox. So
Yeah.
I treat children, I treat youth and teenagers. I don't talk to children about how to interact with law enforcement, because it's not a child's job to remediate for an adult. We are the ones who, put ourselves in the place of expectation. You have a job to do. And as an adult with the person that has, hopefully, because we don't know, who's on these forces, typically developing cognitive skills and maturity and processing skills, it's your job to be the sound mind in the situation. I don't expect the child to be mature enough to say, hold up, let's back up, this is getting heated. That's
Yeah.
not the development of a child. So I don't have those conversations with children, and I don't agree with the idea that people should teach children how to interact with officers. That's just a no for me.
Yeah. What about in preparation? So say something actually happens and the incident has happened, or they're pulled over or something of that sort. And if they do have a language and learning difficulty disorder, what are your conversations like within that space?
Yeah, so I think that if we're doing our job right, as far as clinicians, if you're treating the right areas and you're preparing a child just for life and to be
Yeah.
successful in life, then, I don't focus on, if you get pulled over, this is what you need to respond to, because again, that's outside of my wheelhouse and I'm overstepping my boundaries. I don't know what a parent wants their child or caregiver wants their child to know, or how they want their child to respond. That's not my job. So I don't even step into those realms. I just make sure, tunnel vision, if I am addressing your language needs properly, if you ever are in that situation or any situation, you will know how to respond, because your skills are being stabilized and you've had practice in all general settings.
Yeah. No, that's so beautiful. Like, and you're right, like we don't know what their parents, what those conversations at home are like. And
Right.
yeah, we have to be extremely mindful and respectful of,
Mm-hmm.
here or there. The other thing, Shameka, I've been thinking about recently, just within my practice at schools, and just with people, having conversations with people around pragmatics and social skills.
Mm-hmm.
Now, within the field of speech and language pathology, it's, to me, I think it's very conventional, very almost restricted to,
Uh-huh.
it's not inclusive, or it, maybe it is, but it's not as flexible for someone from a different culture, from a different background. They might have been brought up with different practices. And when we're working with children or adults, the turn taking, the eye contact. And at the moment, I really find that I'm questioning that quite deeply.
Right.
Let's talk about pragmatics. How?
Yeah. So
What's your view?
let's sit on top of that first, because the real issue or concern here is us, once again, clinicians, because what's actually happening is but the clinician is entering the space with their own cognitive bias and their own privilege and their own expectations. And so when you're, like you're saying, when you're talking about social skills and pragmatic skills are stringent, it's not really stringent. It's because you're expecting me to respond the way you want me to respond, and not the way that's conducive or natural to my function in social skills. I mean, think about it. You want me to go and ask 6 people what their name is. But if I live in the hood, I'm not walking up to no random person in the Bronx, New York, and ask you what your name. That's a no. Like, that's not an interaction that we have in this neighborhood. That's against that goes against my culture. That's counterintuitive to my culture. You're putting me in a space of danger. And a lot of times clinicians don't think about that. Their only focus is what happens in the school. In the school is this rose-colored glasses, and they forget that children got to take these glasses off when the bell rings at 3.
Right. So how should we go about actually thinking about social skills? And I mean this as a broad conversation, not just speech and language pathologists, but maybe schools, maybe teachers, just community members. If a
Yeah,
child,
we're gonna keep it 100. I think that we're so busy trying to change people instead of meeting people or youth where they are. Listen, if I know that you stand on the corner and you sell drugs in the morning before you come to school, that's what you do. I'm not a cop. That's not my business. But what I can do is discuss with you the social parameters around problem solving, around, topic maintenance, around the consequential thinking. Those are the things that I can address. And so I think a lot of times we're trying to put squares into round holes. And it doesn't work that way. Like, every child is very different, but our expectation isn't. So we got this box and it's like everybody has to do these things, forgetting that each person is very, very different, personality wise, interaction wise. I might be an introvert, you might be an extrovert. So those type of things have to be taken into account. It really is about us being more realistic with ourselves. At some point, for some reason, we all forget that we were children before we did foolish things.
That's right. And, it goes, I sort of then think about the assessments we conduct, especially when they're standardized. If it's an observation, it's got a lot more leeway and just, a lot more questioning capacity. Whereas if standardized one for social skills, that's actually quite hard and fast. It's here or it's there, sort of a thing.
And they're crappy. I mean, as a person that comes from an inner city, considered under-resourced community, reading those problem solving and pragmatic probes, they corny. They're not real. And it's like, a lot of times the youth can't answer them because it doesn't align or relate. It doesn't trigger anything to me. So I'm just guessing, like, what?
That's exactly right. And I think that's such an important conversations for clinicians to have is when they're doing standardized assessments for anything for that matter, where has this first, like, what population is it for?
Right.
And then who are we working with?
And the other thing, Artie, that we have to talk about, because I'm always going to bring it back to us, right? The other thing we have to talk about is being honest about who creates these assessments, because none of these assessments were created by me or you, or most times by anybody in our culture. So we have, once again, people that sit in a space of privilege and expectation and never experience what we've experienced. Not saying you have, but like the children experience writing assessments and saying this is how they should respond. And if they don't respond this way, this is the same way the court system thinks. But all of you didn't come from the place that I came from. So it's usually problematic. These assessments don't match the real world.
Correct. And do you find that now the conversations are changing, or forget the conversations, actions within assessment creations and sort of court discussions and plans are actually changing? Do you find that since you have been working in that space?
I would say the courts, yes. The legal system is a lot more conducive and open. They're like, aha, it's making its rounds. Us, not so much. I mean, and not that it's a bad thing. I would say for us as clinicians, a lot of the problems are we don't know where to start. Like, making an assessment is a lot.
Yeah,
And, getting an assessment standardized is a lot. A lot of times publications, it's difficult for me as a Black PhD clinician SLP to get a publication published because you don't like the way I wrote it. You don't like what I'm saying. It feels like I'm pointing fingers. There's all these other extraneous factors that
yeah,
has stopped. But right now we have 0.1% of assessments that are written by a Black or brown person. And that's the delve. That's the only assessment we have.
yeah. That's exactly right. And yeah, putting it into asking others to sort of fit that criteria,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's quite a difficult one. Um, Shameka, within your work as a professor, assistant
Mm-hmm.
professor, within human,
Associate.
yes, that was
Don't reduce me. It was hard getting here now.
associate professor. What sort of lectures or what is the conversational space at uni like when you are delivering the message?
It depends. Because I was at a HBCU, a historically Black college and
Oh
university
yeah,
for 10 years.
yes,
So it's like preaching to the choir sometimes. They get it because a lot of the students have experienced it. At the predominantly white institutions, PWIs, sometimes there's a stoic person in the crowd that's a little offended, but it's cool. I've had individuals complain that they were offended or I hurt their feelings, but I'm not here to make you feel good about yourself. That's not my job. You can take it or you can leave it, but the focus is about the children that we work with. So, it just really depends. But the reception has kind of been, the conversations are usually good. This generation of grad students are a little different. They're a little open and receptive to a lot of things that I think before in grad school we were afraid to speak up or advocate for.
yeah, absolutely. And I feel like personally within the conversations I've been involved in or have been listening to, there has been a shift. And I think
Mhm.
people are probably more open to, and I don't know if COVID has a major role to play in it,
Mhm.
where in the 2 or 3 years, you had access to information, you couldn't go out or you couldn't do things you would usually do. Therefore, you were afforded the time to learn, to engage, to interact. And
Mhm.
some people actually did, yeah,
And
really well.
reflect.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
had a lot of time by ourselves. So if you had some stuff going on, you had no choice but to face it because it was you and the four walls that we were stuck in for a very long time. So yes.
That's exactly right. And learn about sort of, or even start thinking about conventions, right? And that
Mhm.
was a huge reflection. I know personally on my part, we tell people to do this, we tell people to do that, and they might do it. That's okay.
Mhm.
But, as a speech and language pathologist, one of our main goals is generalization, and generalization to every part of their life. It doesn't mean just because you're seated in this room, and yes, you could do it beautifully. That's not a
Mhm.
problem. However, is this something that's going to be carried forward? Because if it's
Right.
not, the goal hasn't been met.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think it was a lot of that. I think just the movement, unfortunately, the whole social justice movement, as we were also going through a pandemic, created a shift in the mindset because it was like action first.
Yeah,
And, we had a lot of things that people realized needed to change in that same process of having to face life. At some point, everybody was afraid if they was even gonna make it, if I
yeah.
got it, am I gonna, so it put realism in your face at some point where you got realistic about other things that are happening around you.
That's exactly right. And there was equity in that. There
Mhm.
was no discrimination. It didn't matter what skin color you are, it didn't matter what status. This is a problem for all. The magnitude of it, that would differ, but yeah,
Mhm.
the problem in
Right.
itself.
Yeah.
Um, Shameka, tell us about, so the way we got to, or the way I connected, probably sound like a stalker, but it was it was through one of your Instagram lives, and you were going
Oh,
through one of your assessments, or rather, that live was very much about, I think it was Castle, and you were
mhm.
trying to draw attention to this is what they're saying in terms, whether it was a problem solving one, or
Yeah,
but what background is the child coming with, and is it
right.
actually meeting that? What sort of content would you like, apart from professional, but just real life advocating for, what sort of content do you deliver on Instagram and elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think so the Instagram business page, so it's usually the content is Instagram, the Facebook group, Twitter, LinkedIn, and I'm just now starting to like post more on TikTok. I
Yeah.
don't dance, so TikTok's not my thing. But um the content really is about one, increasing awareness. So I like to kind of keep it in the forefront of dropping knowledge about, this is what could be occurring in your clinical space. Paying
Mhm.
attention to this in your clinical space. Sometimes just like the current post that's up about SMART goals, and SMART goals being more than just the basic, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic. That there's more to it than that you have to keep in mind when you're working with certain populations that we tend to forget. So,
Mm.
I try to keep the content relevant to those things. And then, I have the podcast, which talks about different cases of youth who will try it as adults, and
Ah,
discussing, breaking down the correlations between their cognitive capacity. The podcast is called Cognitive Capacity, their cognitive capacity in their law enforcement interaction.
yeah, right. I'm going to just, yeah, search it up. I didn't realize you actually had a podcast.
Yeah, yeah. So this season one is done. And of
Yeah.
course I've been like super busy lately, so I'm gonna do the opening of season two as a live. So I'm gonna do it as, I'm on Instagram live, and then get it back up and rolling because I've been
Yeah,
slacking.
that's amazing. And I will put that podcast link in the
Thank
when
you.
I upload this conversation, and just different, maybe if you want to share any other links where there are decent resources where people can learn a little bit more about this, because I think this conversation is so important. It's not limited to the US.
Right.
In fact, it's a global conversation that needs to be
Mhm.
had, because in every country, in every city, in every town, there is
Mhm.
that bias that's there.
You're right. You're right. And I think, I've been in other countries. The problem is the research that comes out, or the writing that comes out, it always focuses on what the problems that the child has. It never talks about our role and the things we're not doing as the adults, as the trained professional, as the clinician. When do we start to discuss the pen to practice and what our expectation and requirement is, rather than just reporting Artie has dark hair, Artie has on a white hoodie, Artie has, okay, what, oh, now that we know those things about Artie, what are we going to do about it? And that never comes out in the publication.
No, that's exactly right. And, it just makes me think about us working with a group of students on Thursday. And one of the goals that we were trying to focus on is thinking beyond the picture.
Mhm.
Let's think beyond the picture and let's go. Sure, you can see a picture. It was of this beautiful picture book called
Mhm.
Teacup, and
Mhm.
we were looking at it. It's a boy with a backpack, and he's off. He's had to leave home. This, that, he's at the shore, and one of the pointers to the kids, and I was telling them, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. Now be
Mhm.
mindful, these questions are not a test, but they're to get our brains hot with information. And they're like, weirdo. Anyway, and it was really, the idea was thinking beyond that picture.
Right.
What could it be? Like, why are these things happening? And that's a life skill. To me,
Right.
that is, think beyond what you can see. And if you're able to do that, then you have the capacity to question.
Right.
But the other thing that I think about is the gatekeeping in research. What is actually found out and what are we permitted to deliver?
Right.
What's permitted to be public knowledge?
That's a fact. There's some heavy gatekeeping in research. It's either, very opinionated and skewed. We always talk about what's wrong with Black and brown populations. There's never any positive, conversations around that. Or it is research that we can't actually put into practice immediately. Like even for me, and probably you too, all my degrees, the research goes over my head. I'm like, I don't even care to read it because I have no idea what you're talking about. So it's either one or the other happening.
This is true. I find myself, oh my gosh, yes, educated this, that. You ask me to read a book, like a textbook, and I'll go, no, I might listen to something actually.
And I'm always concerned, like, well, how did I get this far in life? Because is it me? There's really always that question because it just goes over the head.
But isn't that so interesting that we're talking about it, going research papers, academic language, who is it actually lending to? Whereas the way we would learn is, I really deeply enjoy learning through conversation. And it doesn't matter who the conversation is with, whether it's a child, and the things that people come up with, the things they're able to express when the questions are asked, that's amazing.
And that's something that's big that you hit on. I mean, with my population that is incarcerated, this is how we do therapy. There's no drilling. We have conversations like this. We will sit in that cell and debate who's the best rapper, who's such and such, what word. This is how we conversate, and then I reshape those as we're doing it. It's very naturalistic because at that point in your life, I'm not here to walk you through, read this word and let me help you respell it. We got to do this a different way to hit home. And I think that also kind of happens with teaching. Being a professor, a lot of us are theoretical professors, so we just teach straight from the text. But I always say there's a swag to being a professor, and everybody don't have it, which is why some things stick and some things don't.
Absolutely. And we think about, the process of learning. The theories are there, fair enough, granted, and extreme respect to that. However, it is how within the moment to be able to understand the concept, you need to be able to feel it. And if you're not connecting or feeling that information, as interesting as that phrase sounds, are you going to remember it? It's you could just
make it stick.
Exactly. Or you compare it to cram it and regurgitate it, then what?
Right.
And what was the point?
And that's why we have this disconnect in our field with critical thinking, because a lot of clinicians can regurgitate, like you're saying, they can regurgitate information, but they can't critically process that information for themselves to inherently understand it and then roll it back out so it makes sense for somebody else. There's a disconnect.
Yes, that's right. And when you do understand, so on the flip side, when you do understand it sort of within your core, to explain that, oh my gosh, that is so difficult, because you literally, to put it in words, to explain to something why you have made that decision.
Right.
Oh man, Shameka, sometimes I go, someone will think, are you really a professional?
But that brings it home what you said, because if it's difficult for us, then imagine the person with a cognitive or communication disorder.
Yes.
If you can't bring it home, but then you're going to tell me in front of this judge that I should know better. Should I?
That's exactly right. And again, that convention of you should be able to explain your actions, and you should be able to explain it to the breadth and depth of what exactly happened. And I don't
sometimes
think
just cause.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Shameka, has there been something you would have wished I would have asked, or something I haven't touched upon for your chapter?
No, I don't think so. I think
because we've covered quite a bit of ground in the
Mhm.
in the time we've had this conversation. But one question before we do wrap up is,
Mhm.
what sort of platforms do you find yourself going to for resources? And as a clinician, yes, but also as a citizen.
That's a good one. So this is I, life. I don't really go to platforms. I'm gonna just be 100% honest.
Yeah.
And I guess it's gonna sound a little pretentious, but in a sense, I kind of just focus in my bubble. Like I don't really, I definitely, it's very rare that I am, in the SLP realm looking at SLP stuff. If at max, I'm more in the legal sector. I'm reading case books or cases, or because
Yeah.
I'm always doing that. But other than that, it's just life. I still actively treat. I treat all of the incarcerated men and women in Maryland. I'm the only SLP for them. So I still do that. I still treat in my private practice. I still do special education law cases. So my resources are life experiences. And I think that that's important. You can't be an effective professor when you've not touched a client in years or ever. You can't be an effective clinician if you're not in the trenches every day, seeing how life is shifting, how children are developing language differently than they did in 1970 when we were learning about, the longitudinal study. Those things, you got to be in it to do it. So I would say that my resource is just life.
Yeah. And actually the act of doing it, spend some time and know what you're preaching and then practice it.
Right.
Because
It's a fact. I like that. Yeah.
because that's how we learn, right? We learn, it's not a one-way street. They teach
Mhm.
us probably more than what we teach them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Every mistake we have to reflect on every,
Mhm.
yeah. So
Mhm.
no, thank you so much for having this conversation, Shameka.
Thank you.
Are there any 3 to 5 key takeaways you would like for anyone in the world that might be listening to our conversation?
So takeaway number one is, like you said, the youth is going to be the first advocate. They are their first voice. So we don't give youth voices. We just give them the space to utilize their voice. Um, Number two, make it relevant. It's not about you. It's about the child. So step yourself out. Um, and then I think number three is a repetition of it's not about you, but sometimes it is you. So we also got to be realistic that sometimes if it ain't working or you and the child is not clicking, it might just be you. And it's okay to reflect on why you and this individual don't work well together. Everybody's trauma doesn't always blend well. Um, and then stay relevant as far as you got to stay active. You got to stay active if you want to be effective in the clinical realm. You cannot just rely on publications and reading snippets of publications to make you a master clinician.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for all of that information and such important conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
No worries. So for everyone that's listening or that will be listening to this conversation, it will be available on YouTube, the podcast, Human Chapters, and I'll also upload it on the Facebook page as well. So yeah, keep sharing it if it connects. Cool. Thank you. And so
Thank you.